welcome everybody. In about a minute we'll start, but go ahead on to mentimeter.com and you can enter this code or scan the QR code and just fill in the survey here. There's 2 questions that you should be able to access. They're pretty simple. And we're seeing a lot of answers are coming in around more challenges, time, clarity, systems, feedback, personalized technology, integration, defining impact. And then we see there's a lot of answers coming in related to what we'd like to see, how our network could shift, how we could, in how we're approaching impact and evaluation, networks or organizations being more qualitative, being more collaborative, accountability, communication, regular iterative processes, building empathy. I like a lot of this stuff that's on the screen. So as for those of you who are just signing in, we're just looking at this survey that was shared in the email and some of the results that have been coming in. But in just a few seconds, I'm going to turn it off so that we can actually get to listening to our wonderful panelists, which I know we're all very excited for. And actually that's perfect because the music is slowing down. So I'll just pause it there. So here we are. Welcome everyone. I think a lot more people will be signing in the next few minutes, but I also think that we can go ahead and get started. So this is obviously a very, very exciting hour that we're going to have together. A lot of people have indicated that this is a topic that they're very interested in, just based on in 2 weeks the number of people that have signed up. And this conversation is really based on several months of having conversations with funders, with practitioners, with people working on the field, and there's just this kind of like common frustration with the way that we're approaching impact, either in our networks, in our organizations, how it doesn't really match some of the more systemic or network or emergent or complex ways of how work really is. But also an appetite, a huge appetite to do things differently. And so we've been having conversations around how we can shift mindsets. And a few weeks ago, Motaz, who's with us today from Garfield, made a suggestion. Why don't we have an open conversation about this and just start building some energy and excitement? So that's why we're here today, to really take an opportunity to share a whole bunch of diverse perspectives and to build energy around kind of these broader shifts in civil society and change making that we might be able to make. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce you very quickly to the panelists that we have here. And as I'm introducing them, I will spotlight them for you. So we have Charles from the West Africa Civil Society Institute. We have June Holly, who many of you know from Network Weaver. We have Habiba from the Langley Chase Foundation. Mark from Here to There, Motaz from the Garfield Foundation. We have Gurpreet from the Skull Foundation, and okay, Liz, I have to find you now. Hang on. Liz, we have Liz Weaver from, there we go. There you are, Liz, from the Turmeric Institute. And this group is I think a fantastic group of people that represent really a wide variety of perspectives. And I think what's actually quite exciting to me is when we were introducing everybody in this, like having our preparatory conversation last week, a lot of people in this group were saying, you know, I'm not really an evaluation expert. And that's kind of the point. We don't want to just have a bunch of self-proclaimed evaluation experts talking about evaluation, but we want to have real people that are actually struggling with a lot of these challenges talking to us about evaluation. And so that's what we're going to try and do today, is to speak a bit about that. One quick housekeeping, or 2 quick housekeeping items before we start. A lesson that I've learned over the years is to not wait until the last minute to do, here we go, to do next steps. So 2 quick things in chat that we've shared. One is a quick survey. We'll share this again at the end, but like I've mentioned in the introduction, this space is about building energy and finding ways for us to engage in how we can shift the field. And what we have here is a quick survey for how you might want to be involved. You can open it and fill it in now or later, but how you might want to be involved in some of these shifting initiatives around how we're approaching impact over the coming months. And then also, if you follow InHive, which is one of the organizations sponsoring this event, you'll also be able to follow us for any updates on what we're trying to do together. And then one final note is, I know that it's very tempting to write comments in chat as we're speaking, but what I think we'll do, instead of sharing questions and comments while we're going, is I was reflecting on this yesterday, and I was thinking, one of the biggest challenges that we have in how we're approaching impact evaluation is a lot of us aren't really listening in the best way we can. And so I will encourage us to actually be really, really good listeners, and to avoid using the chat for a bit. And then we'll take a pause, and we'll have about 7 or 8 minutes in which everybody can write anything you want in chat. So any ideas or comments or questions that come up to you, write them down maybe on your screen. And then when we take the pause, put it into the chat so that you can share it with everybody. And at that point, the panelists will turn into listeners, and they will actually watch what's going on in the chat. And then we'll come back and continue the conversation, hopefully having fed our panelists a bit with what all of you are thinking and hearing. But without further ado, you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to all of these other wonderful people who speak much better than me. I don't even think I've spotlighted myself. Maybe I should do that. I'll do that later. Our question today is really about, given the complex nature of systems change and transformational impact through change making and networks, what are the implications for how we're doing evaluation and impact-based work on the ground? And I would like to invite June to go ahead and start us off.
Thank you so much. And just to introduce myself for those who don't know about me, I've been sort of an early network practitioner, but really interested in the idea of transformative networks that could really make a difference in our world. And the thing that I've been noticing, so I've been trying to do a huge survey of everything that's happening in evaluation and even learning, impact, tracking. And what I'm finding is just amazing how quickly things are moving and shifting in the area. And I think it's because we're all starting to see just how serious the problems that we're dealing with in the world, and that we really need to find new ways to actually make a difference in our world, that some of the old tried and true ways don't seem to be doing that. And so, one of the most profound things I've seen is this shift to actual learning, to spending huge amounts of time learning. And I know I've been going around telling people, you need to be spending at least a third of your time personally, organizationally, network-wise, learning, reflecting and learning on what you're doing, or else, we're not going to get the insights and breakthroughs we need for transformation. So it's really exciting. We will be sharing some of this annotated bibliography when it's maybe a little bit less drafty than it is now, but I just want to encourage all of you. Maybe what we can do is share some key links in the follow-up emails to some of the most provocative kinds of things that are being said in this field. But we have people here representing these different kinds of perspectives. And I know I'd really like to hear, I think one of the biggest things I've seen is the discussions about power in evaluation, that's critical. If we don't deal with that quickly, and the role of funders in the power relationships. We're never going to get all the benefit we can from people working on the ground. And I know I'd love to hear, I heard a video with Charles was talking about, some of this, and I just like, oh, it really opened my eyes and was very insightful. And I wonder, Charles, if you might speak to some of the things that you are feeling about evaluation.
Yeah, thanks so much, June, and hello to everyone. Really love to have been invited to this space. I think it's a very important conversation. So to the issue of power, from the work that we've been doing, I mean, if I'm using a global South kind of lens, if you look at the way evaluations are designed, the issue of power comes into play when you ask the basic question, what is the measurement criteria, or why are we measuring the impact, and whose impact are we measuring? Is the measurement grassroots led? And most of the time you see from the process, especially from the approach, that most of the evaluations are quite inflexible. They have a certain element of expectations that are actually driven by those who are providing the resources. And then local actors don't feel that they have the respect and freedom that will enable them to really participate in the whole impact evaluation process and determine what success looks like from their own perspective. And so there's a issue of participation in terms of who determines what impact is, and who determines what success looks like, and whether there's actual ownership of the whole evaluation process. So these are some of the challenges that, from the work that I do, from those of us working on the ground, that we face when it comes to evaluation. So I don't know if this is something familiar to everyone, but I mean, these are some of the struggles that we are really facing. And just to add something quick, how do we overcome the typical log frame ways of measuring? How do we get communities more involved in that process? Is it necessarily about results, or is the process even more important than the result? And who is actually determining what success really looks like? And I think for me, it means we need to think much more deeper about our approaches. Yeah. So thanks, June.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yes, so we're just learning the rhythm of this. Thank you,
yeah.
Charles, I'm going to respond to your statement with a question, and then I think others on the panel will have their own opinions on it as well. When you look at the history of evaluation, the issue of power and social justice and participatory approaches, we already started to see that in the 70s, literally. So it's not as if it's new, but I don't think we've been good at it at all for quite a long time. And there is, with the rise of social justice oriented evaluation, including equitable evaluation, making explicit that we need to talk about power right away, that processes should be participatory from the front end, that we should have culturally responsive and empowerment oriented evaluation, and we should ask systemic issues from the very beginning. What are the systemic conditions that keep a problem in place and may even distort the evaluation? We've seen design-oriented evaluation focus a lot more on who really are the multiple users and uses, and acknowledge we have a plurality of use. So I think there's a lot of it's more visible, it's more explicit, it's understood. But then there's lots of moments where we have these, let's call them zombie practices. Like they're dead, but they just keep coming back. Like a log frame. And we don't want to go too far in saying log frames are useless, because they're not. Sometimes they're very useful, but my goodness, there's more tools than a log frame to capture and frame intervention. So I think the zeitgeist, the culture is catching up, but we literally might have a meeting about, yes, social justice, yes, but now we need a log frame and we have to put this in a contract with fixed deliverables. So these zombie practices are as much of a problem as the evolution of thinking. Is that your experience?
No, yeah.
Go ahead, Charles. You respond to Mark's question. Go ahead.
No, I just like the phrase zombie practices. Yeah. And I think that is just driven by I think expectations from many international NGOs and even intermediaries in terms of reporting back. There's so much focus on reporting back and you know, and reporting with a certain narrative that we lose sight that it's actually the impact. We are working for the impact of communities. And I think that's why people still keep on going back to the log frames and don't want to challenge themselves to new ways of doing things.
Yeah. Thanks, Charles. So quickly to introduce myself, I'm Montez. I work at the Garfield Foundation. It's a private philanthropic foundation based in the US. And I would like to say something about one of these zombie practices. So the Garfield Foundation doesn't have an open RFP process, which means the applicants, nonprofits that submit applications for grants, we already are in dialogue with them. We already have a sense of who they are and what they're doing. And that allows us to have a shorter, smaller, simpler, ostensibly, proposal template, fewer questions to ask, less bureaucratic, or so we thought. And then at some point we started to feel, you know, it's still a lot of work. These applications are a lot of work. And some nonprofits, they don't have huge staff. And there's just people spending all night trying to fill in these applications. And that does not seem in alignment with a commitment to equity. That is one place where we very easily ask them, yes, please fill this in. And they have no choice but to put in that time and that effort. And one of the questions that struck us in our application was a question on, and this is from the log frame era, what are the progress indicators, what are the metrics you will be tracking to assess your progress as you do this work? Yeah. Just very standard log frame M&E kind of question. And people would fill it in, would answer it very reasonably and with very robust indicators. And when it came reporting time, myself as a program officer, I wasn't interested in those indicators, frankly, because there was other stuff that I knew happened that mattered. Some of it had been named in the indicators, and some of it hadn't, but mattered. And some of the indicators no longer mattered. And of course, we know from Michael Quinn-Patton and the whole developmental evaluation work is that, yes, the indicators will shift because life. And so a big decision for us was, and this was an internal structural thing at the foundation that needed leadership. We're like, well, can we just slash that requirement and take out that what metrics are going to track from the template, which was scary, but we just like, let's just slash it. And that required also working with the software we were using. So there was responding and stepping into alignment and integrity with a commitment to equity around a very minor evaluation thing, required some internal, structural, and technical adjustments.
Yeah.
I mean, that just reminded me that when I first came to Lankali Chase, I'd come from a grassroots organization. And I remember working with someone, they say his name was Mahmood. And my job was to support Mahmood to get to find work, because that's what the funder wanted. And it was important to the community for jobs, because obviously jobs are really important. And took about 5 years to get Mahmood a job. And we were celebrating, I mean, you know, having a lunch, celebrating in his favorite restaurant. And he'd been in the job for 4 months. It was amazing. Mahmood had a whole history of addiction, mental health, hospitalization. He'd been in care. There was a lot of stuff that happened. And I was like, well, Mahmood, what made a difference? 4 months, like most times we wouldn't get this far. And Mahmood was like, well, I'm not sure. I'll tell you what happened. This person, let's say her name is Aliyah. Aliyah wanted to have sex with me And I just need to make sure that if someone wants to have sex with me, and I've been given a bit of time. And that was my first time that I paused and I thought, hang on, somebody desired him and he's in a relationship. And this has tapped into deep motivations. And he had talked about this anger management he'd had years ago. And he had remembered to use some of the tactics he'd learned in anger management course. Now, how do you measure this, right? Whose impact are we talking about? Is it the anger management? Is it the desire? Is it the internal stuff? So it raises all these questions. So when I get to Lankeli Chase and I've been asked to work on a place work, and places have long history and they have context and they have all sorts of stuff that's going on. Well, how do we even start to talk about evaluation and impact in a place like this? And so one of the first things that we did, having going around in circles, was to abandon any idea of evaluation and impact. And then we adopted this idea of learning and quantifying, because quantifying was important to people. And that's been our approach so far.
Excellent.
It really reminds me, this whole conversation, Mark, of the workshop that you and I collaborated on a couple of years ago around evaluating community impact. And, you know, one of the things that we're interested in at TEMRAC is really the learning. And we work with, 400 community-based roundtables in a whole variety of domains across Canada and the United States. And we know that the work that they're doing is leaning into systems and transformative change. But how do they know that, right? And how do we learn alongside them and start to see what patterns are emerging across the different efforts, and then think about how those can be either scaled in different ways of scaling, right? Scaling deep or scaling across or scaling up. And I think there's there's a lot to unpack here, because when you're looking at the notion of transformative change, right, that higher order of systems change, the communities or the individuals that are doing the work have to be engaged in the learning process with you, right? What are they seeing? What are they learning? What questions are they bringing to the conversation? And I remember, Mark, in the early days when we were thinking about evaluating the first iteration of our Vibrant Communities initiative, we focused on one of the users of the evaluation as the communities themselves, right? What questions did they have? And we also asked the question, what did at the point that we were getting to 10 years in this initiative, what did the funder want to know that was different from what they wanted to know in the first stages of it, right? What questions were emerging for them now? And I think a lot about, learning as such a critical component of all of this, because learning is really how we shift, adapt, and change in real time, right? And we know that in this work, communities are shifting, adapting, and changing in real time as well. And so to be engaged in an active way of learning alongside really helps us, at TEMRAC, to kind of understand patterns, to understand points of opportunity, and then to use the leverage that we have in a unique way, not only to support the communities that we work with, but then to support, collective learning around these transformative processes. So, yeah, and the one thing that June, your comment raised for me, I always see this work as being in tensions of one part to another part, right? And so there's the complexity of change, but there's also the tension of creating simple ways of navigating complexity, right? There's the process product tension. There's the evaluative outcomes and the sense making and learning, right? And it's sometimes we pull at this string or this elastic in this way, or we snap in this elastic in this way, and then how do we, those of us that are engaged in this work, how do we live in that tension? What's the tension calling to us in this moment that we're in?
To that point, Liz, I think navigating those tensions can be crazy making, given how many stakeholders. So I work within the School Foundation, which is an odd context. It's an endowed grant-making foundation that is many steps removed from folks actually doing the work. And even in that context, you have so many stakeholders with different needs, which raises up naturally many tensions. And I think one thing that has actually anchored us over the last year and a half that we've been developing a new evaluation learning approach is the role of vision. So having some line of sight to where do we want to go, either expressed as a desired transformation or milestones on the way to that transformation. And having that North Star in place, I think, has at least helped us try to navigate some of those tensions. And I know that's a very abstract, kind of making a very abstract point here, but I really want to pose a question to others in this fishbowl. How do you see the role of having a clear vision in evaluation and learning? What either at the community level and really harvesting what do specific communities need and want, all the way to say even what a donor like a School Foundation is aspiring for?
Yeah, the idea of this tension is really critical, and designing around it. And when you were talking, Liz, about essentially the idea of data indigestion came to mind. We could do all the harvesting and collecting of data, and we can include every stakeholder in every conversation, and we invite them to read every report, and no one would get anything done, and that would be not just process fatigue, but it would be death by process, death by update. And I see that as sort of a caricature of one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is no learning whatsoever, no adaptation whatsoever. And so what is that center point? And I find myself more and more looking to the natural world as an analogy, and human beings perhaps as a kind of balance point where internally our bodies, our nervous systems are responsive. They're constantly learning, responsive to our temperature at the chemical level, what we're needing. And there is that constant engagement, but it's not too much. And then going one step up, perhaps, and behaviorally, we look out to the world. I'm going to walk this way, not that way. It's cold out. I'm going to walk inside. That might be at the strategic level, thinking about, annual conversations for organizations. As humans, when we're inundated as organisms with too much information coming in, it can feel like anxiety. And so we have mechanisms for regulating that. And we typically know, we have a sense for what is salient and what is not relevant. And there's a judgment there. And I think the trick is figuring out organizationally, how can we make our organizations, be they funders, nonprofits, movements, or so on, attentive to what matters in ways that enable us to be responsive to, for that learning to be transformative, actionable, without it slowing down and taking time and resources from the work we're actually trying to do. And I'll give a very small example of that. There's one framework, the Darcy framework. It's like a project management tool. Some people might be familiar with it. Who decides, who's accountable, who's consulted, responsible, and who's informed. It's a way of parsing who needs to get what information when, and it frees up lots of people. And one tiny thing we did on our team, internally, our program team at a foundation, because so many of our grants are supporting experiments in systems practice, we have to think together about how's it going? What does this mean? Who should we connect this with? What are we learning from it? We have to process a lot. And yet our program team calls, we're full of all this process stuff. So we found a way to okay, for the agenda, there's like 7 of us. For our team agendas, just mark the agenda items with like a key. Do you need a discussion around this, or do you just need the rest of the people to know? And for other people to know, just make sure they read it before the call. So what that did is it freed up time, the precious time we did have together for that sense making. I'll end with that.
Okay, I want to just challenge you a little bit, because I think that the learning does need to be focused. I really agree with you there. But I think the place where the most interesting learning is happening is in collaboratives of people from like different organizations or different communities. It's when they get together and they are both helping each other change, and they're trying an experiment. And so I think figuring out how to really help those collaboratives learn. And I think the best place they learn is in learning communities, where you have sets of groups experimenting on something usually somewhat similar, and they can share together, steal ideas from each other, but also go into some deep reflection to notice, like, oh, wow, look what you did. Because I find one of the hardest things is for people on the ground, they're so creative, so inventive, and yet they don't realize that they've made like a breakthrough innovation until they talk about it with others, and other people say, oh my gosh, tell me more. I want to learn about that. So I think the level of learning, that both that sets of collaboratives, and the other place is your networks of networks, that we need to really be setting up learning between our networks and what I call provocative networks that, and that's what I think the Global South for the North's been incredible provocative networks, as we're seeing some of that interaction, because that's where the kind of learning that's really going to make a difference is happening, when different perspectives come together and they say, oh my gosh, I've had these blinders on. You've just, just like when I heard Charles, you've taken off my blinders. So, I think the organizational level, not to say that's not important, but I think these kind of 2 or 3 areas I've talked about are really places that are important.
I just want to, go ahead, Charles.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Mark. I just wanted to say something just quickly about what June was saying. And one of the things I've noticed in many communities, especially where I've been working in Africa, is that sometimes we forget about the power of storytelling in terms of how that helps with learning, but also helps with capturing and getting communities to really understand what evaluation is about. Because sometimes I think that the understanding of why evaluation is the challenge, why sometimes there's not much learning happening. When communities understand that, this is an opportunity to tell your story, your own authentic story of the before and after, conversation, before initiative, after initiative, in your own words and in your own experiences. What happens is, what I've seen is that when other communities hear these stories, they get inspired to make changes in their communities. I've never seen people read M&E reports and get inspired. I've never seen that. Never. I'm hoping to see that soon. But I've seen people read people's stories and get inspired and want to make changes in the community. So I think really getting people's stories, documenting the stories of change, and using, and that becoming the basis of measuring what impact is, I think is key to learning, and it's key to getting communities to drive the evaluation process. So I just wanted to add that.
Mark, I'm going to invite you, Mark, to share one comment, and then we'll take a pause and let us all read through some comments that are coming in chat. And for everyone else, if you want to start sharing comments in chat, we'll do about 3 or 4 minutes of a chat pause before we restart and re-energize. Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks. Brennan, I'm just going to return to this idea of zombie ideas. I'm writing stuff down as we chat. So 3 zombie ideas that if the zombie practices that if we change them, it might make it easier to do this. Number 1, to your point about Darcy Montaz, why don't we do user profiles? Tamarack, we've got some resources on this where we say who needs what information, when, packaged how, for what purpose. And to be really clear about going in, focusing the learning a little bit. We're never going to be perfectly right, but we'll be more intentional, and it allows for emergence. And confirm that the social innovators, you ever been in a plane and you see the instruction where the mask, it says, if the mask come down, put it on yourself first, and then help those around you. Why don't we do that for social change and innovation? Innovators, you get to put your evaluation mask on first. You're number one. And then we'll deal with the credentialized stuff, right? Half the time, funder reports, the primary purpose is to trigger the release of a check. That's its function, right? And we all know those stories. So, and reports, number two to this point, what if report writing is a zombie practice in the sense that it's not, I love that, Charles, not monitoring reports don't inspire. What if it's the socialization process, the engagement process where people internalize stuff? That's the major thing. And we are so razor sharp that if we have to blow money on a report, and I'm overstating this because sometimes they're really important, here are the minimum specs of that report, and here's when and how we do it, but that's not the primary deliverable in an evaluation. It's good socialized learning processes. That's a zombie, maybe a non-zombie practice. And the very last one, who says that we have to write the reports? Michael Quinn-Patton shares a great example of IDRC where managers, let's say, Charles, you and I were in the same change initiative. I would write your report and I would have to interview you to learn your stuff from your angle, right? And then you write mine because we already know what we know. And if you're writing mine, and you're going to pick up stuff that I didn't even know because you're asking me questions. So even the function of Charles doesn't have to stay up till 2 a.m. Writing a report. I mean, she might have to stay up to 4 a.m. because you're interviewing Mark. But so I think there's all these, there's devil in the details. Very practical things we might change to turn some of this stuff upside down. Brendan, that was a long thought. I apologize.
It was many great ones that combined into one overarching one. So I'll put on some background music. There's already tons of comments that have come through. So the panelists will just spend the next 3 minutes reading and picking out some things that they might want to respond to, and just allow us to listen to some nice tunes as we share any other thoughts or questions that we have for just about 3 minutes.
I just love how long these comments are. They're so deep.
Lots of great comments coming in. If you want to keep sharing comments for about a minute or two, that's fine. I want to reopen by just looking through the comments. I think I'm seeing there's two, if I can really kind of narrow it down, two big shifts that a lot of us have been talking about, and I'm seeing them coming through the comments. One is how to shift people's minds, how to get people, especially those with power, which is where Charles started this whole conversation, like the funders, to actually be willing to adopt some of these principles and practices. And another one is I think about how to do it. So a lot of people might be in agreement that we need to do more storytelling, we need to do more on the ground listening and local engagement. But how to do it in a way that's effective, efficient, that's actually not requiring thousands of people to go out and do thousands of interviews, or which obviously no organizations have those kinds of resources. And so I think I would put to the panelists, in addition to any other thoughts that those are just some of the thoughts that I noticed, but maybe to focus the next, let's see, we have about 12 minutes, a bit more on the how. How can we really move towards making this work? For one example, something, and Habiba, Mumtaz, Gurpreet, Charles, go ahead and unmute now as well, so that we're all here. I think one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is I think we have this impression that we as the central organizations need to actually be doing all of the work, versus finding ways that we are more coordinating and setting up the structures so that the local people on the ground, whether it's a network or whether we have multiple offices or whatever it may be, or multiple communities we're working with, that they are the ones who have the tools to be able to talk about stories together, to reflect on them together, and to embed these processes not as like these big, huge things that we need to do once a year, once every 6 months, but pretty much in everything we do, have 5 minutes at the end of a space that we're together to reflect together, to capture that effectively and efficiently. So pulling from some of my actually background in self-management and decentralization practices, that's one thing that's on my mind, a practical, just to give the panel a bit of an example of how I'm thinking we can help maybe some of the people in this group that are, I think, struggling with how do we make all of these things work? So Gurpreet, you haven't spoken in a while. Do you want to jump in and just share any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, maybe to the question of how to do it, can speak to two ends, kind of a higher level and a lower level. So at the foundation, I think my team has been on board for a new way of thinking about impact and evaluation for a while. I think the challenge was then convincing our peers and our leaders for the shift that we need to make. And to do that, I think what worked really well was based on our foundation's values, which you can find on our website. We essentially created principles. So what evaluation and learning principles do those values imply? And we came up with 4 buckets of principles: equitable, collaborative, adaptive, and purposeful. So for example, one principle under the equitable bucket was we intentionally shift power from the foundation to our grantees, partners, and the communities they work with, and center their perspectives and needs. So later down the road, whenever a tension has come up around, say, where we're centering ourselves and not centering the needs of our grantees, we can point to that principle and say, hey, remember, we agreed to this, and we agreed to move in this way or in this direction. And hence, this is why we need to, say, maybe not create a burdensome reporting requirement. So at a higher level, having those principles in place, having those agreements in place, have been helpful. At a lower level, then, when it comes to the challenge of we don't have limitless resources to do the work in the most ideal, best, perfect way possible, I think one thing that has worked well for us is kind of reframing the role of an evaluator internally, say myself and my colleagues in the team, is that really thinking of ourselves as reporters and sense makers, where we're kind of relying on various sources of data and knowledge and weaving that together. So that might be, rather than always requesting a report from an organization, going onto their website and even their Google News, if you could search for them on Google News and see what's coming up and trying to make sense of that. And of course, there's a lot of bias inherent to that, and there's some questions and comments in the chat pointing to that piece and issues of different interpretation. And we still have to make the leap to how do we check that sense making But I think there are some creative ways we can move forward. And the last thing I'll say is really thinking of this as a design problem. And it's the challenge of how do we do this field wide is a, in its own way a systems design problem. And I can only speak to the one node of that, which is the where I work at the moment. But I think that there's some kind of low hanging fruit creative things that we can do to get around those resource constraints.
One of the things that we have focused on about learning is for us. So it's accountability for ourselves. And our partners could also do that for themselves, but it's really for ourselves. And so learning is not then about demonstrating performance. It really is about accountability to ourselves and using that. And that's been really, really helpful, because what it does is it reveals the kind of the intimacies of this work that can be really difficult to understand when you're reading an evaluation or when you're not in the context. That's one thing. But the other thing we also have to continuously do is to make visible the ridiculous assumptions behind the kind of evaluation paradigm. The constant set of assumptions around cause and effect, measurement. So we have to ask very simple questions. Well, can you give me an example of when actually this was the cause and effect of this? Just give me an example. And when someone gives you an example, you can also say about all the other things that could have affected it. So trying to make visible that ridiculous stuff so that we can chip away at some of this. So that is some of the things that we do internally and we do with each other. But also we have to also acknowledge that there are some people who need structure, who need rigor. And I am not sure, personally, I'm not sure what to do about them and that need, because I don't really have an answer for that.
Well, I think somebody made a really interesting comment about infrastructure. And I do think there is this support system that you need for this kind of shifting from more evaluation to learning and infrastructure. And part of it, like one thing I've seen work is to have a pool of, say, conveners or facilitators who can convene learning situations. So if somebody says, I want to learn more about this with others, that there's somebody that they can draw on that can help them set up the Zoom session, figure out and work with people in the group to become self-managed and self-organized themselves. The other thing is, for an old lady, I'm really geeky. I love data. And I do think that data can be really useful to people, but it's for people on the ground. I think people on the ground need to decide, well, what do I want to be having us gather data on? And there's more and more ways you can do it, just like a part of your discussions on a platform, for example. You can capture data and see, are some people dominating the discussion? Are others being left out? Or like my old thing, network maps. I had to finally stop doing network mapping, even though I loved it, because I couldn't find funders or communities that would actually spend the time and resources to learn how to read and make sense and tell stories about the maps that were created. And so, I think this process, there's data, and we need to let people know the kinds of data that can be easily collected, but make sure that we have the capacity there to make sense of those, that data and use it to actually make our networks healthier, more effective, more transformative.
It is ironic, right? That, we want to really focus on learning for transformative change, and yet making the case for learning from an organizational perspective like Tamarac's is much more difficult, right? And so a lot of the way that we are able to advance that is through our own entrepreneurial practice, right? Because that's the way that we can grow the pushing out of information to broader and making it open and accessible, is that we've self-funded that at Tamarack to create our learning center and to do that. So it is interesting, because it's a conundrum in this work, right? the work of community change is even a bit more tangible for funders in some ways than the work of learning and learning as a network and a node. And so I think it is interesting, this conundrum that we find ourselves in, that, you know, to get to a deeper transformative change, you really do have to learn, but to resource that, to build capacity, to engage in conversations, to create the nodes for those conversations, in some ways has to be funded differently. And there are some funders that will invest in that, but it can be a bit of a stretch for some folks. And then how do you, you know, if you're truly committed to that, you know, at Tamarack, the solution has been that we self-funded, and we, you know, we look upon our model as a co-invested model, that everybody who is part of our network invests in the co-design and the co-learning approach. And I think, yeah, it's just interesting to me, June, the things that you've raised.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to comment on Habiba, the question you raised at the end of your comment about rigor. And I really love the user profiles framework. And for those of you who, yeah, I guess, Liz, you shared a resource on that. Thinking about an ecosystem of end users, of people who have questions and data needs. And they will begin with the beneficiary communities and the people doing the work, and peer practitioners at a professional level who are invested in that discipline of practice, whatever it is, public health, agriculture, whatever domain activities in. And also the IRS perhaps, or like government oversight agencies that want a particular accounting protocol, just so that, you know, that money is being accounted for. And essentially saying, so the rigor question, I think where we're coming from, and someone mentioned something around this in the chat, it has been skewing, unfortunately, towards or unduly towards the quantitative, with a very particular culturally specific understanding of what is rigorous, what is rigorous knowledge. So it's academic quantitative knowledge. And there has always been acknowledgement that no, qualitative data is as important. And that is not just 20 years old, it's like 120 years old. Because there was a response to, you know, empiricism and Cartesian way of seeing the universe. And, you know, this movement of phenomenology where people said, wait a second, reality is mathematical, but it's also emotional and aesthetic. And all of those together give us the full picture. So what does it mean then? So for some of our stakeholders, it is important, and rightly so, that they get longitudinal studies, that they get the data, and that data be used in some ways. And so for like a soup kitchen, we need to see numbers, how many people were served at that soup kitchen. And we need to know what the vibe was. And sometimes one will be more important than the vibe or the number of people served.
No, I think it's, I just want to just build on what Mutaz said about rigor approach. I think sometimes one of the things we need to really ask ourselves is, the learning that we're getting and the approaches that we're using, is it something that the community has owned and drives? And I always go back to that, because that's why we do this work. And I will give you a very, you know, typical example of an evaluation process of a self-help organization I was working with in Northern Ghana that wanted to evaluate a livelihood project that we're doing for a community, or with a community. And, you know, they didn't know where to start from, because they had this, you know, zombie-like, just to borrow Mark's words, kind of log frame stuff. And they said, Charles, what should we do? And, you know, so we just started with a basic conversation of, okay, what will success look like? You know, it's a very simple question. But what I said to them was, just tell me in your own words, in pictorial form, in a story form, in any form that you want, what you think success will look like. And then, you know, we define that. And then over the time, I asked the basic question of, okay, how would we ensure that we are meeting, you know, we are going to achieve what we've agreed that success looks like? And then, so then they determined their own milestones. They said, okay, in the first year, this is where we want to go, in the second and in the third. Then I said, okay, how are we going to ensure that this actually happens? Then they said, okay, we're going to form a committee, you know, a learning kind of committee that will meet and ask 2 questions: what worked and what didn't work? And then we'll get what didn't work, share that with the larger community, get ideas on how to respond to the challenges that we face. But we are very much interested in documenting the stories that come out through this process. So we're interested in what's happening with our contributions and participation in that story, in the journey itself. And so this is how we set up what we called an M&E system, but we didn't really call it evaluation, but more of like a guide to ensure that the community achieves its objectives. So it was more like a learning guide, you know, and for me, that works. It worked. It was very simple. And we got the community to own that process. And I think that is what is key. Instead of the M&E officer in a specific NGO or an M&E officer, you know, that works for the funding organization, the community itself owned that process, and they were proactive. They provided the data that needed to be provided. They did the documentation themselves. And basically the M&E officer was rendered irrelevant because they are the ones who put everything together, and they owned it, and they justified, and they said, this is what we want. This is what we want to see. So this is our expectation. And so for us, we are making progress, right? And I think that is what's key in terms of shifting our mindsets about evaluation.
Yeah, and thanks, Charles. There's some people saying in the chat, thanks. And I think that was actually a great story to end on. We're talking about stories and how we can illustrate impact in stories. You're illustrating the impact of changing the way that we talk about and approach impact through a story. I know there's so much more we can talk about. I shared a few links a few times in the chat. I just shared them again. I'll just share it one more time. There's to embed learning in this space. There's a quick link for sharing closing thoughts. And just a reminder, this was what we hope will be the first of many conversations. And so the big goal of this space was actually to build energy so that we can move forward and learn more together and really start shifting on a broad scale how we're doing this, because we all know that the way that most of us are doing it is not the right way. So I want to give a big thanks to the panelists, a big thanks to all of the wonderful comments in the chat. We will be sharing the recording, we will be sharing the chat afterwards, and the links again. And just want to wish everyone a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you in the world. And hopefully we will see each other soon.